So I did see Joan. I don't know if she's going to join us or not, but we will get started. So today we are going to do the financing commitment and appraisal contingencies. Go over those line by line. The financing contingency, you'll find that in the offer to purchase, the WB11. There are a few main sections of the financing contingency itself on lines 247 to 287 of the WB11. We've got terms of the loan, so the section where we are describing the terms of the loan for the buyer, the satisfaction of the contingency, the seller's termination rights, if there is a delay in delivering the loan commitment letter, and then financing unavailability for the buyer and what that looks like for a buyer in terms of delivering notice, and the proper steps to take. So, and declaring the offer null and void. See who we got here. Okay, so getting right into it, describing the terms of the loan. So beginning on line 248, if you're going to include the financing commitment contingency in the offer to purchase, you are going to mark that box with an X. I always like to remind people that if you are not going to include a contingency, so whether it's the financing commitment contingency, whether it's the inspection contingency, whether you are going over the offer and get to the section on secondary offer, wherever there's a box that you are not including that provision or the contingency item, please mark that box with an NA. That also just shows and proves that you have gone over that section with a buyer when you're writing the offer to purchase with them. It's just good practice. So if you're not marking an X to include that provision or that contingency, please mark this with an NA. So I'm just going to go right through it. This offer is contingent upon the buyer being able to obtain a written, and then on line 249, we've got a blank space here for you to indicate the loan type or the specific lender that the buyer is using. So this offer is contingent upon buyer being able to obtain a written blank first mortgage loan commitment as described below within 25 to 30 days after the acceptance of this offer. So going back to that first blank line, you're going to put in the loan type here. So our options are generally conventional loan, an FHA loan, a VA loan, jumbo loan, are the typical types that you would put into this space here. Again, you can put in the specific lender as well. I don't think that's very common. I don't think you would want to necessarily put in a specific lender because it's oftentimes that buyers could switch lenders within that first week of an accepted offer. So I don't think I've ever seen anyone actually write in a specific lender in that line. So continuing on, 9 times out of 10 is probably going to be a conventional loan that your buyer is obtaining. So I'm going to start back over. This offer is contingent upon the buyer being able to obtain a written conventional loan, conventional first mortgage loan commitment as described below within. And then this is going to spell out the deadline days count for obtaining that loan commitment. So I wrote 25 to 30 in here as an example, but I would say 30 is probably typical for a lender to work through the underwriting process and issue that loan commitment letter for the buyer. These are definitely conversations though that you are going to want to have with your buyer's lender. In this competitive market, you know, the sooner that we can get these deadlines cleared, the better for a seller. So for example, a lender who I really like to use, he is able to typically get a loan commitment letter out to me within 21 days. So always ask that question to your buyer's lender. What is the fastest we could close? What's the fastest you could issue a loan commitment letter? Because that will definitely help your buyer in a competitive situation. So moving on line 250, so the financing selected shall be in an amount of not less than blank for a term of not less than, and I put in 30 years here, amortized over not less than 30 years. So this is the term length of the loan. So your buyer might be getting a conventional 15-year loan or a conventional 10-year loan. If it is a 15 or 10, you would put those numbers in these second and third spaces. That first blank space is the amount of the loan. So if your buyer is writing on a $200,000 house and they're putting 20% down, that loan amount is actually 160. So you would not put the purchase price in here, you would put the actual loan amount. So that's the purchase price minus the percentage down that they plan to put down. And those are conversations with your buyer. So usually I'm asking those questions at buyer consultations. How much do you plan to put down? It can range from anywhere. There are conventional loans out there that will do as little as 3% down. I would say what's kind of typical for a first-time buyer is 5 to 10% down. And it's great if your buyer can put 20% down. Again, in this competitive market, that's meaningful to the seller. The more money they're putting down, the stronger the buyer is. So again, in that line 251, you're putting the loan amount, not the purchase price. Go back. And then this is kind of moving on line 252, excuse me. So initial monthly payments of principal and interest shall not exceed. And then you're going to put in that principal and interest calculation based off of, and you're going to need to use your mortgage calculator for this. But that's going to be based off of the loan amount, the interest rate, and the length of the loan. So you would plug in $160,000 based off of it. In the example I have here, I have 3.5%. So 3.5% over 30 years gives that principal and interest payment of $696.33. That number would never change over the life of the loan, unless, of course, your buyer's refinanced for a different interest rate. So that's a fixed amount, that fixed number that never changes. Then continuing on line 253, there's a acknowledgement for the buyer. So buyer acknowledges that lender's required monthly payment may also include 1/12 of the estimated net annual real estate taxes, hazard insurance premiums, and private mortgage insurance premiums. The mortgage shall not include a prepayment premium. I like to make sure that the buyer understands this, especially first-time home buyers, that 696.33 number in there based off the principal and interest amount, that is not what your total mortgage payment is going to be. Your total loan payment per month, mortgage payment per month, is also going to include amounts for your escrow for taxes and insurance. So just again, more like education for the buyer so that they understand that they're making sure that they're taking that into account. So you can help them with that figure as well. Their lender should be going over those figures with them. But this is just another reminder for them that principal and interest amount is not going to be what they're paying every month towards their mortgage. It's likely going to include taxes and insurance escrow payments as well. A buyer agrees to pay discount points in an amount not to exceed blank percent of the loan. I have never seen anybody put any percentage points down here to help buy down loans. I was talking with Joni about this. I don't know if Joni is on right now. But I think the last time we did this training, she said the last time she saw that was in the 80s, when interest rates were higher, much higher, like north of 10%. So it's not going to be, I'm almost sure it's not going to be in your practice to ever put in discount points there. If it is, the lender will help inform that. Moving on, so if the buyer is using multiple loan sources or obtaining a construction loan or land contract financing, please describe at lines 543 to 551 or in an addendum attached per line 573. So that's just a direction for us as agents. If the buyer plans to use multiple loan sources, that we need to name those in the additional provisions of the offer to purchase. And then just a note about, have a question? And also I would like to remind you guys, could you guys please mute yourselves? Okay. I hear some static in the background from somebody. All right. Okay, so land contract. It might be the case where I have seen it twice in my time as with KW, that a land contract was used as financing. If a land contract is going to be utilized in a offer to purchase, we will have an attorney draft that for the buyers. We can include and state in the additional provisions that it will be a land contract financing financed offer. But we as agents, we do not fulfill or write out the terms of those land contracts. So just know in the back of your head, if that question ever comes up, that we would need to redirect a buyer to an attorney to write it up. And if you don't remember that, just see Joni or I. Moving on, and then just another provision for the buyer. So buyer agrees to pay all customary loan and closing costs, wire fees, and loan origination fees, to promptly apply for a mortgage loan, and to provide evidence of application promptly upon the request of the seller. The seller, and then now here's another provision for the seller. Seller agrees to allow lender's appraiser access to the property. I have this highlighted because I just want to get it in your heads and make it a part of your practice, that once you get an accepted offer, I think it's really important as buyer's agents that we are helping to make sure and ensure that the offer to purchase is getting over to the lender. You know, we're obviously giving them direction, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, please send this offer off to the lender. But I think we should just make sure that we are getting it done by sending it off to the lender ourselves. And I also think that's a good way to establish a relationship and communicate with the buyer's lender. I'm usually sending a copy of the offer. I'm giving them in the body of the email the appraisal due date, the closing date, and the loan commitment deadline, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then I'm also asking them to send me I think I got it, never mind. So again, I just want to make sure that the lender is getting it in a timely manner, the offer to purchase, because as soon as we get that accepted offer, our deadlines start, right? So, and this warning is like purely off of a lesson that I had to learn when we didn't make sure that a buyer sent off the offer to purchase to their lender, and they just kind of sat on it. And, you know, 2 weeks go by and we don't hear from anybody that an appraisal had happened or was being scheduled. And we come to find out that the buyer had never sent over a copy of the accepted offer to the lender. So, yeah, so we had to extend dates and deadlines because of that. Not fun. So, But then back to just, I think, a good practice, I would always, once I send over the copy of the offer to purchase, I'm always asking that lender to send me an email back confirming that the buyer has officially applied for their mortgage. And then I take that email and I send it off to the listing agent as just evidence that we have gotten the ball rolling and that the process has started. So it's not a requirement to send an email like that verifying that they have started the application process unless the seller requests it. I am just proactive about it and making sure that everyone knows that it has started. So lines 260 to 262, loan amount adjustment. So this is just getting ahead of the fact that the offer or that the purchase price might change from the original offer amount in the offer. So if the purchase price under this offer is modified, any financed amount, unless otherwise provided, shall be adjusted to the same percentage of the purchase price as in this contingency, and the monthly payments shall be adjusted as necessary to maintain the term and amortization stated above. So if your $200,000 offer price ends up being 210 or 220, you don't have to rewrite the terms of the loan based off of that new number. It just automatically adjusts. So that's nice. Before I continue on, do we have any questions thus far?
Are you going to be going into when people like have to get out of the deal on the financing contingency or aren't able to come up with the funds that they said they would have in this contingency? Because that sometimes confuses me a little bit. You know, people are always like, well, you know, I think we're only going to put 5% down, but we could put 10% down. So what should we put in line 251? And I'm just, I get a little confused.
Yeah, well, if we're gonna go over financing unavailability, but I don't think that I would get that detailed into, but we can talk about that now if you want. So I think the best protection would be to say that the buyer is probably going to be putting less down and then give them the option to put more down if they want. Or on the flip side, actually, if you wrote that they could put 20% down and they are unable to because they cannot show proof of funds for that 20% down, then the lender is going to have to serve a rejection letter based off the fact that they were not able to fulfill or get that 20% down. So that's conversations back with the lender, but if the lender looks at their financial picture and sees that they cannot put 20% down, then he would have to serve a notice of, he would have to serve a rejection letter based off the fact that they couldn't put that down. But then also it's like up to the buyer to to communicate to the lender that like they don't want to go through with the offer to purchase, even though they could still get a loan based off of 10% or 5%. If they do not want to go through with it and they can get out on the fact that they don't have 20% down, they could do that. So it's because they're not fulfilling the terms that they described in this original offer. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense.
Okay. So actually, it would, I think I need to sideline that conversation because we don't also want to like put that they're going to put 20% down and that was never going to be their intention either. And we just put it in as a safeguard, right? So So let me do some more discussion on that question. And let me do some more discussion on that question. But basically, I mean, the crux of it is that if they, again, if there's any part of this that they cannot fulfill, then the lender could serve a notice of a rejection letter and help, and you would serve that and declare the offer null and void based off of that.
And so I've never had to do that, fortunately, but I'm just curious. So if you do get a rejection letter from the lender, and you give that to the listing agent, is it guaranteed that they get their earnest money back, or is it
I mean,
not?
it's fulfilling the terms of here. So so unavailability here.
And we can just save that question because you're probably going to get to it. So
yeah, we'll get to it. We'll get over there. Okay. Sorry. I got a text from Sid. So I don't know if somebody's having a question about. Okay. I'm going to move on. We'll get to there. We'll get there. Okay, so lines 263, 264 and 265. This is where we are putting the, whether it's a fixed rate financing or an adjustable rate financing. So 9 times out of 10, your buyer is going to be using fixed rate financing over the life of the loan. And you would have a conversation with the buyer, or sorry, with their lender about what rates are at. And so on line 264 is where you would put in daily interest rate plus what's typical when you're writing an offer is to add 0.25% cushion in there when making these calculations. So hi. So Joni is behind me. So we'll tag team this together.
I'll just listen in. Sorry, everybody.
So with the fixed rate financing, adding that 0.25% to kind of help cushion that dollar amount, that principal and interest payment. So the communication to your buyer when you're going over this is not that this is what they're necessarily going to be locking in at, but just communicating to the seller that this is the highest they would be willing to go. So if that 3.5% rate suddenly jumped to 3.75 by the time that they locked in and they were not comfortable with that increase in payments, kind of back to Bridget's question before, that's a term that was not fulfilled. And they could, if they wanted to, get out of the deal based off of the fact that they couldn't lock in at that 3.5% or lower. Does that make sense to everybody?
And that just happened.
Okay.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So the lender is usually the one that's providing this information to input, right?
Yes. So
Okay.
if you don't know, if you're not sure of what, the latest interest rate is, then yes, it's a phone call to the lender asking them. So, if he's
Okay.
like, yeah. So
And does the pre-approval lock you in at a rate, or does the loan commitment lock you in at that rate?
once you get an accepted offer and apply for the mortgage, that's what locks in the rate. So usually pre-approval letters are not naming interest rates directly on the pre-approval letter, because again, they fluctuate by day. So by the time a pre-approval letter could be issued, months before you actually get an accepted offer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, you might receive that pre-approval letter, be working with the buyer for a month or two, and then you're going to circle back with that lender and say, we're ready to write an offer. What's today's rate at? And then again, I would add 1/4% to cushion that. Adjustable rate financing. I'm not going to go over this line by line, but again, the lender will help inform how to fill that out. And I don't know the last time I saw an adjustable rate
No,
financing.
Money's too cheap.
Yeah. So again, kind of going back to that principal and interest amount, you are going to use the loan amount on line 251. And this is all going to be inputted into your mortgage calculator. I use Carl's mortgage calculator if you want to download that. But you're going to use the loan amount, input the number of years of the loan, so 30, 15, or 10, and then the interest rate, and that will inform the principal and interest amount that would be put in on line 252. Okay. Any questions?
Not a question, but just kind of an example. This was about 6 months ago, maybe. I had a buyer that wanted to buy a duplex in Bayview. It ended up being actually like a 3-unit building, and I'm not exactly sure what the problem was, but the banks didn't like it. It wasn't like compliant with some sort of zoning or something. So we had put in 4% because I gave it a little cushion, like you were saying. And then my buyers were not finding good financing because there was some sort of a glitch. So then we went back and we said, we want to get out because of financing. And they said, well, are you within the parameters of what was in this section? And I was like, oh boy. So I had to go and find out what their interest rate was, and it was above 4%. So then they said, okay, well then you can get out of it. And then we cammered it. So that was an example of that.
Great. Awesome. So actually, now that Joan's here, I'm going to revisit Bridget's question. And I hope that I'm like trying to figure this out in my head in real time. So, kind of along this same line, if a buyer had written in here that they were going to be putting 20% down, and they were somehow not able to put 20% down, I mean, that is justification for a rejection letter, even though they technically could probably get a loan at 5% or 10%. But that's, a term that they wrote and wished to happen.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why a seller would choose that offer. Say if there were several offers and one buyer was putting 20% down, one buyer was putting 5% down, they're going to pick the one that looks more financeable, which is obviously a 20% down payment. The fact that they go for a 5, or they can't get the 20 with 20% down, they should be able to get any loan that they.
Right, but if they wanted to use that fact to get out of the deal because they didn't, because they weren't putting 20% down, could they?
If the lender would write a rejection letter.
Yeah.
And the rejection letter is not that you're not about your down payment, it's about whether you get a loan commitment or not. So it would be hard not to get a loan commitment when you have 20% down. No, the loan amount is just based on, as I said, it would be appealing to a seller because they probably wouldn't get a rejection on a 20% loan down payment.
I think Bridget, I think these are things too that we could talk through with the lender, like what are grounds for serving a rejection letter? And I'm sorry that it's not cut and dry.
Well, I mean,
Oh, it's so hard just because they're always asking, well, I mean, they want their offer to look better. So they're telling me, well, we definitely are, interest rates are low. We'll probably only put 5, but we could say we can put 10. And I'm just like, what do you mean? But I guess as long as the pre-approval letter says they can, then that's
Well,
Well,
and
I
the
can
lender,
look
the
at-
lender will have a copy of the offer. So the lender will see that they have written an offer saying 20% down. And if they're not putting 20% down, yet their offer says 20% down, that's not going to swing well with the lender. Not that he's going to write a rejection letter, but he's going to say, where's your 20% down that you wrote in your offer?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, another thing that we were talking about is like, what happens if there are buyers who are saying that they're putting 20% down just in competitive situations? You know, that's,
Mhm. I don't know. I would say that the lender, I don't know.
I mean, I guess that's a form of,
Fraud.
yeah, it's not writing in good faith.
Right.
So, I mean, I
And,
guess
and I'll tell you, the penalties for mortgage fraud are huge, not only for the lender, but for any agent that participates in it, whether they're aware of it or not. Mortgage fraud is something that, everybody should be on their toes about. So I can't imagine a lender being comfortable with giving them or having them apply for a loan with only 10% down where they said in their offer that they were putting down 20. Most lenders aren't going to swing with that. Because nobody
Here's-
wants to be party to mortgage
so
fraud.
I guess it would be the same way as like if you're writing a cash deal, and you decide to get a loan on, like if you're not able to get that loan, then, the default is still that you are able to bring cash.
Right.
So if they're gonna write 20% down, then they better make sure that they actually have 20% down. And if they have conversations with their lender that they would rather go to 10%, then great.
But they're still on the hook for putting 20% down
If-
and probably getting the loan commitment if they did that.
So,
It's called lying.
If I'm a listing agent and I have a buyer's agent say, oh, they don't have any money all of a sudden. We know we said that they had 20% down and the lender said they had 20% down, but they don't have 20% down. And here's our rejection letter. You can't really, there's not much to do on the listing side if that happens, or?
Well, we had something similar to that not too long ago. And again, it goes back to the lender. Is the lender going to write a rejection letter because all of a sudden they don't have the money to come up with that? Probably. If they don't have the money to secure the loan with a down payment they said they were going to do, the lender is saying, well, then I can't give you the loan. And they probably would be able to get out of it, but it all depends on what the lender is willing to go along with or write.
that's another thing. Yeah, we'll get to the next section and talk about that too, because the last time we did this training, Joan made comments about this too. It's like the lender can't just write a rejection letter willy-nilly,
Some will,
so
but then they don't have a very good reputation.
yeah. So, all right, any other questions before we move on? Okay, and thanks for sharing that example, Amy. We love examples. Okay, so satisfaction of the financing commitment contingency, seller termination rights, and financing unavailability are the next sections. So lines 270 to 275 describe what happens when we do receive that loan commitment letter. So if the buyer qualifies for the loan described in this offer or another loan acceptable to the buyer agrees to deliver to seller a copy of a written loan commitment. The contingency shall be satisfied if, after the buyer's review, very important that buyer's reviewing, buyer delivers to seller a copy of a written loan commitment, even if subject to conditions, that is, signed by the buyer or accompanied by the buyer's written direction for delivery. So once you receive that loan commitment letter, you must get that actual loan commitment letter signed by the buyer in order to deliver it onto the listing agent to satisfy the contingency. Or it can be accompanied by that permission to deliver notice. Since this changed in the offer to purchase, my practice is just to have the buyer sign the loan commitment letter. It's 10 times easier. A lot of times you'll get pushback from listing agents who forget about this change in the offer and really push for a permission to deliver notice. It's not required. It's sufficient to have the buyers just sign the loan commitment letter. Line 276, delivery of a loan commitment by buyer's lender or delivery accompanied by a notice of unacceptability shall not satisfy this contingency. So the buyer's lender cannot deliver the loan commitment letter directly to the listing agent. That does not satisfy the contingency. It has to go through the buyer first. And then a caution for the buyer. So the delivered loan commitment may contain conditions that the buyer must yet satisfy to obligate the lender to provide the loan. The buyer understands a delivery of a loan commitment removes the financing commitment contingency from the offer and shifts the risk to the buyer if the loan is not funded. So this is very important. If the buyer receives a loan commitment letter, but there's still a number of conditions that have yet to be met, you're going to want to pause on sending that off to the listing agent, because if for whatever reason, once that letter is delivered, that we've fulfilled the obligations of the loan commitment, financing commitment contingency, and if they fail to meet one of those conditions that was named on that letter, they're still on the hook for buying the house. So very important that you are also reviewing these loan commitment letters. And if you have any questions about any conditions named, you need to go back to the lender and ask them, is there any risk here? So a lot of times it's just administrative things that the lender has to get through, and it's nothing just outrageous that there wouldn't be any like fear of it not being met, the condition not being met. There could be other things though that the buyer would want to see satisfied before they are comfortable delivering the loan commitment letter. If that is the case, then you're going to want it to extend the loan commitment deadline before actually delivering the loan commitment letter. So if you have any questions about that, ask Joni or I, but again, if you have questions about the conditions themselves, your first phone call would be back to the lender. Any questions about that?
Say an example, say the buyer didn't want to write a house sale contingency in the offer because they either had an offer, they thought it would be really easy to get their house sold, and they knew it would hurt their chances of their offer being accepted, so they don't put in a house sale. But then they get the loan commitment, and the loan commitment has one of the conditions that they bring the proceeds from the sale of their house in order to get this loan. That's a huge condition and will show up in the conditions of a loan commitment. So if that loan commitment is delivered, the buyer is on the hook to show up at the closing table with the proceeds of the sale of their house in order to be able to purchase the new one. So I've seen that happen. It is real. One of the things that you want to make sure that if you're the listing agent is to ask the buyer's agent, do they have to sell their house to get a loan? Ask it right up front. They may not have made it a house sale contingency, but it may be a financing contingency.
Ask. All right, moving on to seller termination rights. So if that the financing contingency deadline comes and goes, it does not automatically mean that the deal is dead. But what it does do is it gives the seller some termination rights. So I will just go through it, 281 to 283. If the buyer does not deliver a loan commitment on or before the deadline on line 250, the seller may terminate this offer if seller delivers a written notice of termination to the buyer prior to the seller's actual receipt of written loan commitment from the buyer. So let's say there's a 30-day deadline and you guys did not extend that loan commitment, financing commitment contingency deadline. And day 31 happens, nothing happens. It now just gives that seller the right to serve a notice at any time declaring the offer null and void. So they must do that though before that loan commitment letter is sent. So you could hit day 31, nothing happens, loan commitment isn't delivered, seller neither delivers a notice of termination either. And then day 32 comes, again, seller opts not to terminate the offer for any reason. Buyer can deliver that loan commitment letter on day 32, and we have satisfied the loan commitment contingency, even though it's past that original deadline. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Financing commitment unavailability. So line 284. If a financing commitment is not available on the terms stated in this offer, and the buyer has not already delivered an acceptable loan commitment for other financing to the seller, the buyer shall promptly deliver written notice to seller of the same, including copies of the lender's rejection letters or other evidence of unavailability. So in practice, what you are doing is you're taking that rejection letter, filling out a notice stating that the offer is null and void based off of financing unavailability. You're going to attach that rejection letter in the attachment lines on the notice and deliver that to the listing agent. And, Bridget, back to your other question, does it automatically mean that they get the earnest money back? It means that they have exited the deal through a legitimate means, which is their financing commitment contingency. I can't say for sure that the seller won't try and fight that because they have that right at all times, but they're doing it legitimate. The buyer is getting out in a legitimate way. So the likelihood of them getting their earnest money back would be high.
Right.
But yeah, a seller can, I think it's pretty cut and dry with a rejection letter.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, it's just, I found that a lot of agents didn't realize that all three parts have to be sent to camera a deal out. And that is the letter of rejection from the lender, the notice stating the reason why they are getting out of the contract because they can't meet one of the contingencies, and 3, then the camera. So truly all 3 has to be sent. Now, there are situations where a camera can just be delivered on its own and there's no need for a notice to explain the reason for getting out. Say there really isn't a reason a buyer and seller agree that they want to terminate this. That can be done with just a camera alone. But a true ending to a contract should be the notice why the contract is ending, the evidence of why that is being, which is the notice, and then the camera, which explains where the earnest money goes.
yeah, just good practice. So,
Are you able to talk a little bit about what the camera is or what that
the
means?
cancellation agreement. So it's a cancellation agreement and mutual release. So when a offer ends prior to closing, then the parties must fill out what's called a cancellation agreement and mutual release. It's releasing them from any liability or the potential for being sued or gone after. And then it also spells out where the earnest money is to be dispersed. So if it's going back to the buyer, or if it's going back to the seller, or if the buyer and seller are deciding to split the earnest money. But it's just the official way to end the transaction and must be executed by all parties. Technically, if that is not signed, we've had many cases where buyers have ghosted and a seller wants to move on to another offer. They can't technically, unless they get, after talking to attorneys and getting advice from attorneys, that's not a call that we can make. But they technically can't accept another offer because they don't have that cancellation agreement in place. So it's a very important document. Okay. and when you have come to that, you will reach out to Joni or I once you have a deal that's going to fall apart. Okay. And then just a reminder, you know, if you have sense that things are going to go sour, make sure that you're reaching out to us, you know, promptly to help. You know, there are ways that things can be saved too, you know, and help talking through that and getting advice on that.
It's also a time, if you talk to us, it's also a time where we can sort of clarify what you can be saying to your client and what you can't be saying to your client.
True.
Because you're about to step into a legal situation when terminating an offer. And you want to make sure that what you're saying is correct, that you're not saying something that could be construed as legal advice. You might be saying something that say, oh, don't worry, you'll get your earnest money back. I mean, you can't say that. Sometimes it's obvious, it's clear, it's right in the contract, it was properly terminated, but still where the earnest money goes really is a legal situation. So when you're getting into a situation like that, it's really good to contact Steph or me just to make sure that you're being compliant.
Okay, so we've got 13 minutes left. This completes the financing contingency. I do have the appraisal contingency in here as well. I think we could get through this in 13 minutes. If we go over a little bit past 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock, you guys can still sit tight. That'd be awesome. But the appraisal contingency usually tied in with the financing contingency, of course, are lines 308 to 326 of the WB11. There's the appraisal contingency itself, and then the right to cure is attached to the appraisal contingency, and we'll go over that. So starting at line 308, this offer is contingent upon the buyer or buyer's lender having the property appraised at buyer's expense by a Wisconsin licensed or certified independent appraiser who issues an appraisal report dated subsequent to the date stated on line 1 of the offer, indicating an appraised value for the property equal to or greater than the agreed upon purchase price. So what we're looking for, what a lender is looking for, the reason why the appraisal process is put in place to begin with, is the lender is wanting to ensure that they are not lending more money to the buyer than the property is worth, if I phrase that correctly. This is a protection for the lender and a protection for the buyer too. They want to make sure that, you know, that the buyer is not overpaying for the property. So this is why an appraisal happens. This contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless the buyer within, and I put again that same range of 25 to 30 days, after acceptance delivers the seller a copy of the appraisal report indicating an appraised value less than the agreed upon purchase price and a written notice objecting to the appraised value. So again, kind of in practice how this is all happening, once you get that accepted offer, the lender's role, the lender steps in now and they're ordering the appraisal. So just logistically, that is not something that you have to handle as the buyer's agent. The lender is ordering that and taking care of scheduling that. I usually say that the appraisal deadline, I usually mirror that with the financing contingency deadline and do that 25 to 30 days, but usually that appraisal is happening much sooner than that 25 to 30 day mark. Because in order to issue loan commitment, we need to get that appraisal done in order to issue that loan commitment letter. So the appraiser goes out to the property. They're using the same data that we have access to through the MLS. They are verifying that the property, you know, is in line with the market, right? And then they are issuing an appraisal report. So that appraisal report, the lender wants to see that appraisal value is at least the purchase price or higher. If it comes in lower, then we have options as buyers, and the right to cure can get kicked in or cannot get kicked in. So if that property appraises lower than the purchase price, the buyer has the right to choose to exercise that right to cure. Let me backtrack here. I feel like
Whether he's giving the seller the right.
whether he's giving the seller the right to cure on it or not. So, and it works the same way as the inspection contingency. So if you're giving the seller the right to cure, as it relates to the appraisal contingency, if you receive that appraisal report back and you, as a buyer, and it's lower than that purchase price, if you have given the seller the right to cure on this, and you choose to serve a notice that the appraised value is lower than the purchase price, the seller has the option to come down to that appraised value, or if they have the right to cure, they have the option of killing the deal themselves and saying, I'm not willing to come down to that lower appraised value. I'm going to let you out of the deal. If you do not give the seller the right to cure in this case, then the ball is in the buyer's court on whether or not to serve a notice and kill the deal themselves. So if the seller does not have the right to cure in this case, the buyer receives that appraisal report and they can say, I'm not willing to move forward on this. I'm going to serve a notice and kill the deal myself based off of this low appraised value. And the ball is in their court to kill the deal right away and not have the seller kill the deal, or give the seller the option of killing the deal or not. So it works the same way as the inspection contingency. In practice though, I'd like to speak in terms of that versus what's, I think it's very rare that right to cure kicks in actually with the appraisal contingency. Usually what's happening is you're taking that lower appraised value and serving an amendment back to the listing agent, back to the seller, and negotiating a new price. So whether that is coming down to the appraisal value, if that means buyer and seller are meeting in the middle on the purchase price and the appraised value, or working out something else. Again, in your practice, your first line of offense should always be to renegotiate that number if buyer and seller are willing to.
So if you have financing in your offer and you do not check appraisal contingency, you are still going to get an appraisal on your property because it's required by financing. They will give you a loan after they appraise it. So marking appraisal contingency doesn't mean whether you have an appraisal or not. It just means that it has to appraise at the purchase price or higher in order to go forward. In a competitive situation, it's going to be a lot easier for a seller to accept an offer without an appraisal contingency because it's one more area that the seller has to, he has the comparison of an offer without the appraisal contingency and an offer with it. He probably would take the offer without the appraisal contingency, knowing there still will be an appraisal tied to that buyer getting financing. That buyer can still negotiate. If he gets a low appraisal, he can still try to negotiate with the seller, as Steph said, with an amendment. Maybe we're $10,000 off the appraisal. Let's split it into, if you come down 5, I'll come up 5 or whatever, to see if we can meet the appraised price for the bank to give me my loan. So I can get my loan if we can meet this appraisal, but you're going to have to cooperate with me, or the buyer can come up with the cash difference himself. But the point is, the appraisal can still be negotiated if you don't have an appraisal contingency and you are just using the financing contingency, there will be an appraisal there. And there's a lot of confusion about this. I think it's something that Steph and I maybe have to reiterate again in a team meeting situation. Because I know a lot of agents, especially newer agents, always put an appraisal contingency in. And a lot of agents who've been in the business for a while are hesitant about putting it in. So
One more point about that too is that if the buyer does not opt for an appraisal contingency and just relies on the financing contingency, if that lower appraised value comes in, the buyer and they cannot, and there's failed attempts at renegotiating down to that lower appraised value, and they cannot come up with the funds, they would be able to get out through the financing contingency. Now, if I can, Bridget, am I able to call you out for a second?
You can call me and my buyers.
Your buyer's out, yes.
Thank you.
So last week, Bridget had a scenario where they did not include the appraisal contingency, correct? You did not include it.
We included that. We checked the box and we said we would cover any gap between the purchase price and the list price. Because that's what, yes, they wanted to do, I promise.
Same sentiment applies here then, whether you checked the appraisal contingency or not. But, you know, if you are expressing to the seller up front in the offer to purchase that you are willing to, you know, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot in a way. If the buyer is not really willing to cover that gap, then you shouldn't put a provision like that into the offer to purchase. So what the provision was, and this is happening in competitive situations, you guys, is communicating to the seller up front, if the appraisal comes in lower than the purchase price, we as buyers are willing to either cover the gap totally between list price and purchase price, or we are willing to pay $5,000, for example, over the appraised value. And, you know, again, the seller has to accept this, but you're just kind of getting ahead of it to make your offer more attractive. So if you find yourself in a situation where the buyer is suddenly like, I don't want to fulfill that provision that I had stated in the offer to purchase and that the seller agreed with, you know, then I think there's an issue, you know? So I don't know that a buyer could get out on an appraisal contingency after making that claim, making that promise. Right. So if I was a seller and received that communication, I would be,
there's no problem.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, I want to just warn other people on this call too, because you know, you explain the risk to your buyers, you explain that it could appraise low. Do you have the money? You're going to have the money to come up. It could be $5,000 or it could be 30 grand, depending on, you know, what you're covering. And what I found is they say, yes, yes, yes. You know, they're emotional, they're excited, they're writing the offer, and they're just in the back of their head, hoping they're going to like win the appraisal lottery. And then when they don't, they come to me and say, well, we didn't think it would happen to us. And that's what I'm dealing with this week. So a warning to everyone that I think, you know, we all know this, but buyers get, you know, they want the house and they start saying they'll do all these things. And then when push comes to shove, they finally realize that maybe they don't want to put every dollar they have in the down payment because an appraisal came in low or whatever it might be.
And you never know how low it's going to come in either. I mean,
yeah, that's
outrageous. I mean, it's almost like writing a cash offer and then not having the cash. If they're offering something like that, I would even ask for proof of funds. You know, show me proof of funds that you can come up with $10,000 or $20,000 gap in an appraisal to protect you and the contract and these buyers so that they can't say at the last minute, oh, well, we don't have that kind of money. We can't do it.
Another,
I have a question about like, so the having like the gap, like, you know, like offering to cover some amount of like a gap versus just not having an appraisal contingency at all, but like if needed, you could fall back on the financing contingency. So like I guess I don't know like in which case you'd go, like it just seems like in that case, it'd be always better to just skip the appraisal contingency. If you can't get financing because it appraised too low, then it seems like a stronger offer in like kind of all scenarios, and then you don't have to deal with the like kind of mystery floor of what the appraisal could come in at.
so, I think the challenge, it depends on who you have on the other side of the listing agent. So I have omitted appraisal contingencies and have not covered any communication regarding the appraisal. We all know an appraisal is going to happen because of the finance, you know, because it's being financed. And I've had listing agents come back at me and say, that's great that you didn't put an appraisal contingency. We know
Yeah.
that one is still going to be required. What if it comes in lower? Is your buyer willing to cover a gap, go over the appraised, you know, and they're getting ahead of it for their sellers, you know, because they might have other agents who have communicated that up front. So it all just kind of depends on the situation. And then on the flip side, I've omitted an appraisal contingency, but then I've also covered my buyer and communicated upfront in the offer that should a appraisal be required for the financing contingency, buyer is willing to cover the gap between, and we'll kind of do a lower threshold and do that list price so that, you know, so we have some idea of what they could potentially have to bring to closing and the purchase price. Does that make sense, Kelly?
There
Yes.
still will be an appraisal in the
Right.
financing contingency. Not marking appraisal contingency doesn't take that away from the financing.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, sometimes with listing agency, like Steph was saying, they don't get it. They think if you didn't mark appraisal, that you're trying to get a loan without an appraisal, and that doesn't happen.
Yeah, so it's kind of
I
just,
mean, sometimes there's refinancing without an appraisal, but I've rarely heard of a mortgage loan being done without an appraisal.
that also depends on the strength of the buyer, because I actually just had I have
Oh, yeah.
a buyer who's
Ton of
putting
money.
25% down and the lender waived
No,
appraisal.
right.
So,
But that's still just within the financing contingency.
yeah,
It doesn't affect at all whether the appraisal contingency was or was not checked.
right. That was all buyer circumstance, yeah.
I have a quick question. If you say you're gonna cover $10,000 gap and then it appraises and you're like, yep, it appraised for $15,000 low, Mr. Seller. So we're covering 10, you have to come down, 5. I guess I've been hearing that even then, sometimes sellers are pushing back and saying, no, so I guess I thought if you put that we'll cover 10 above, but I guess a seller can always walk away because in the end they have the right to cure.
Well, no, I'm going through this right now with one of our agents who they wrote the house was 350. Just gonna give the real numbers. The house was listed at 350. So buyer wrote for 365, said that they would cover a gap in appraisal $5,000 over appraised value. The appraisal came back at 333. Listing agent didn't do their job. I don't think they didn't show up to the appraisal appointment or provide comps. And so now per the terms of the offer, the new purchase price is going to be 338. And now I've got the listing agent telling the buyer's agent, well, we'll just put it back out on the market. Well, they can't just put it back out on the market. They have to fulfill that 338. So the onus is on the seller or the listing agent there.
And we don't talk enough about that as your responsibility as a listing agent. Part of your responsibility is to get a good appraisal.
Mhm.
And that means working with the appraiser, give him your comps, showing the property in the best possible way for the appraiser to come through.
I also want to make one more comment before we hang up. As buyer's agents, if you are going to be writing in the offer to purchase that the buyer can guaranteed, the buyer is guaranteed to cover a gap of like $20,000 or whatever it may be. Your next conversation back to the listing agent is, please help me get this appraised. Because don't be lazy about it. Please act as if you needed to see it appraised too. Like, we don't want the buyer to bring extra money to closing if they don't have to. So
Teamwork.
teamwork. All right, I'm gonna
Okay.
stop share. And again, I always like to point back to our Zoom trainings. So we had the same exact financing commitment, contingency training, and appraisal contingency training in June of last year. And then also there is a training in there on the right to cure, as it relates to both the inspection contingency and the appraisal contingency. So revisit those trainings as well. And we just really take a deep dive into the right to cure. So, and then this will be uploaded and put on the YouTube channel as well, of course. And then next week, we do not have a training because I think most of the world is on spring break. So we're not gonna be here.
Not me.
And then we're gonna pick back up the following week, and Joni's covering, I think we're doing addendum R and miscellaneous
Yeah,
addendums.
O and R and
Yeah,
escalation.
and all that. Okay. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for coming.
Joan,
Thanks, guys.
can you call me whenever you have a chance?
Yeah, we're going into a meeting right now, but I'll call you after that.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.